and we will be recording the session, as we mentioned earlier on, which again, if you're not happy with that, turn your camera off. It's not really an interactive session, it's more of a presentation where I invite questions. There is a bit of a time restriction as well. I've had to condense my presentation because normally it's 3 hours long. And I'll also skim over some bits because I'm going to share the presentation with you so that you can look at it in your own time when you get a copy. So I'll just share my screen now.
So while you're doing that, Wayne, can I just confirm that if people got some questions or observations, if they could put them in the chat, because we can also pick them up later on, that would be really helpful.
Okay, great. Hopefully you can see that, everyone.
Yes,
I can't see
yes.
it, but yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
We can see it.
Okay, so let me just get this right. Forgive me. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to show you a little bit about my career to begin with, just so you have a sense of my social work background. So, you know, just have a quick browse of that. My first role was as a placements officer for a private fostering agency, as an administrative worker. And then I moved into various unqualified roles in criminal justice and youth justice. Did my social work placements in adult mental health, and as a duty and assessment officer in child protection. I then worked with care leavers for a number of years, and then as a supervising social worker. And I've been at BASW for coming up to 4 years now. Just a few slides on my organisation for those of you who aren't familiar with BASW. We are the British Association of Social Workers. We were established in 1970. We're a member-led organisation. All of our members are social workers at different stages of their career. We have roughly 21,000 members across the UK. I think it's nearly 22 now, actually, as well. And we pride ourselves on being the strong, independent voice of social work and social workers. I'm going to skim over these slides. You'll be able to look at these in more depth when you get your copy. But just to underline that we pride ourselves on being the strong, independent voice of social work and social workers. There's a few slides here just on the nature of our work and the various work streams that we're involved in at a national and regional level. Code of Ethics, which I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, the Professional Capabilities Framework, or PCF. Those underlined links there, when you get your copy of this presentation, will take you to those resources. We have a number of specialist groups involving children and families, adult social work, mental health, criminal justice, and so on. Again, each of those groups have members that are all at different stages of their careers in terms of those specialisms. I'm just getting a little bit of feedback there. If I could just ask people just to go on mute, if you don't mind, please. We have an established network of branches across the UK, and there are a number of events, conferences and webinars which we organise and facilitate. Now, normally, prior to COVID, all of those would be face-to-face, but over the last year or so, they've all been online. And that web link there, that underlined events section there, will take you to our events page on our website. We're involved in lots of different policy and research activities, and we liaise with the regulator, Social Work England. I'm not going to labour these other work streams that we're involved in, but just one I'd like to highlight is the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, or BPS group at BASW, which is a group that I founded last year, which is a safe space for social workers from those backgrounds to be able to offload, but also look at how we can improve the various frameworks within social work to improve the outcomes for social workers of colour, as we know that they are oppressed, for brevity, in various different ways within social work. Now, I know that these sessions normally, from what I gather, are focused around mental health and well-being, which isn't, you know, I wasn't fully aware of that, but and I will try and weave some of that into this presentation. But primarily, my role at BASW now is around anti-racism in social work. So I guess in terms of the mental health and well-being dimension of that, it's about, for me, the protections and support that are available for social workers of colour. And I'll go on to explain why I feel those protections and support are needed, and why there are huge deficits and voids in a moment. But I guess that's the lens that we could perhaps look at that this morning in terms of mental health and well-being, the mental health and well-being of social workers of colour, but also allies and potential allies. So I'll begin by outlining my perspective on anti-racism in social work, which is both personal and professional. There are very few black male social workers, which I'm sure you're probably already aware of. My opinions don't represent all black and ethnic minority people's opinions. We're not a homogenous group. I refuse to be the tokenistic black voice of BASW. I'm one of many black voices in social work, and just an ordinary guy, to be honest. I'm not an expert in organisational development or leadership. However, I am an expert with lived experience of personal and professional racism in life and in social work. And these are purely my opinions. And I have to emphasise that this presentation focuses on social workers of colour and not service users of colour. And the reason for that, as I say, is that a lot of my work has kind of highlighted that there are no real protections there for social workers of colour. They have to deal with all the difficulties and the obstacles, the barriers that social workers generally face, with an additional layer of institutional, structural, systemic racism. And again, I'll go on to outline that. I hope those images at the bottom there give you some insight into my perspective on this. This is a wordy slide, so forgive me. I will paraphrase. So why was George Floyd's murder such a catalyst? Well, George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. The world has seen the evidence. His murder was the latest in a long line of atrocities, brutalities, and calamities endured by black and other ethnic majority communities. And there's a long history of this, but very rarely is there kind of honest acknowledgement about the history of it. Some people call it George Floyd's death, but I think that's a dilution of what occurred. He was brutally murdered. I then go on to outline a number of incidents just prior to George Floyd's murder, which I feel was, kind of further exacerbated the pain of that situation, and then talk about, the endless examples of police brutality and the strong links to slavery and colonialism. But I'll let you look at that slide in more depth when you get your copy. I do think the images there at the bottom capture a lot of what I've tried to say there. Black Lives Matter. It's a global movement demanding for black lives to be valued equal to white lives. There's a long and enduring history, which I've talked about, of that not being the case. White or all lives matter in response to BLM is not comparable or relevant, in my opinion. This is like asking, what about colon cancer during a discussion about breast cancer, or advising a bereaved mother that all lives matter at her child's funeral. Save the whales does not mean that the sea life is not important. White lives have always mattered, so to keep proclaiming white lives matter adds excessive value to them, tilting us further towards white supremacy. And again, I hope the image there on the right hand side conveys the message that I'm trying to put across about equality. BLM has its critics, but it's unclear why a movement that promotes equality is demonized by some people who vehemently claim they're not a racist and advocate for freedom of speech. And I've highlighted A there because I think that people quite often think that you either are or are not a racist, but actually, there's a grey spectrum there, in my opinion, a continuum. So it's about people being honest and realistic about where they are on that continuum. So here's a few examples of my activism on anti-racism in social work. I did promise Andrew that I would speak a little bit about Outlanders. So Outlanders is the hidden narratives from social workers of colour, and it's a book that myself and Siobhan McLean published in March. We're really proud of it, and it includes the stories, essays and poems from social workers of colour, talks about their personal and professional experiences, their observations, and I think it's a really unique and rich book. So I'm just going to read you a short excerpt from my story called Ambition Navigation in Outlanders, and it's just a bit at the end, which is about what are the lessons I feel I've learned from my professional experience. So based on my experiential knowledge, my advice to aspiring professionals is be resilient, use your passion to fuel your determination to succeed and bounce back when needed. Utilize the advice / support of your formal and informal networks and identify suitable mentors and positive role models. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Recognize the compatibility of personalities is key in developing effective professional relationships. Know your rights and assert them when necessary. Do your homework, be prepared and be proactive. Geeks prosper. Don't dwell on the negativity of discrimination. Maximize any opportunities for positive discrimination. Be self-aware and recognize the ways in which you can be easily labeled, stereotyped, and categorized, as well as your own inescapable racial lens. Don't be deterred by rejection. Mishaps, mistakes, and misfortune are good learning opportunities. Always seek feedback and consider how you might do things differently next time. And finally, be authentic and stay true to yourself. So that was just a very brief excerpt from Ambition Navigation in Outlanders. As I say, if you've not got a copy already, go and have a gander and have a look, see what you think. As I say, we're very proud of that. So there's a number of other activities I've been involved in as well, a number of events that I've spoken at, the Guardian Social Lives event last year, the BPS group that I founded that I talked about before. I was speaking at an event with David Olasuga, the Black British historian. There's a number of articles where I've spoken about a range of issues with regards to anti-racism in social work, in terms of regulation, in terms of how to promote anti-racist cultures in workplaces, and so on. There's a number of what I regard as kind of revered anti-racist pioneers that I've spoken alongside, including Gurnham Singh and Kishpati Sinclair, and a number of podcast interviews, etc. So what I could also do actually is when you get your copy of this presentation, there'll also be a copy of the portfolio there, and that will that has all the different activities listed with web links, etc. So you'll be able to look at some of those events and read some of those articles if that's of interest for you. Another wordy slide, forgive me. So the wake-up show. There is a big difference between being anti-racist and not wanting to be seen as a racist. People are sometimes more scared of being labelled as racist than they are of actually being racist. An individual or organisation that is anti-racist is much more likely to recognise why they themselves are potentially racist, understand how they have been socialised to be inherently racist, and identify the benefits they receive from the existing racist structures. Those embracing macho, anti-woke, and politically incorrect descriptors as laudable, even a badge of honour, seem unable or unwilling to view introspection, self-reflection, or self-awareness as supreme personal qualities. White psychosis, as described by Kahindi Andrews, is expressed in strange ways. It's a damning indictment on society when to be described as woke or to be a do-gooder or in any way virtuous is considered derisory. This defies my sense of logic and is selective outrage to me. Personally, I think it's an important quality to want to do good for my fellow human beings and strengthen our societal interdependence. I challenge anti-woke people to actually define the word woke. Many of their responses are laced with absurdities. Some will cite the Commonwealth as a victory on race relations. Common wealth for who? Possibly a Freudian slip in retrospect. Ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy social justice can have. And that's a quote from James Baldwin that I've altered slightly. So what is anti-racism? Anti-racism is a belief that all races and ethnic groups are equal and deserving of the same opportunities. But the most important part of anti-racism is the next step, which is to do something about the existing inequality. Anti-racism is the active dismantling of systems, privileges, and everyday practices that reinforce and normalize the contemporary dimensions of white dominance. This, of course, also involves a critical understanding of the history of whiteness. And that's a quote from How to Be an Anti-Racist from Ibram X. Kendi. I'm not going to labour this slide. I've tried to correlate the relevance of anti-racism to social work. I've outlined there the professional standards from Social Work England, which I think are most relevant, but you'll notice that there's no explicit mention of anti-racism in there, which I feel is a sort of deficit and a void that we need to address and rectify. I've also highlighted there the Code of Ethics, which BASW are the custodians of, which again has relevance in terms of anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory and anti-racist practice and values and ethics. I've included some links there to some BASW position statements condemning George Floyd's murder, promoting anti-racism. But to be honest, there are a few more statements that we've written more recently, which I've not captured there. So we have been active in that regard. And again, that highlights the relevance and underlines the relevance to social work. There's a link to an article there called Confronting the White Elephant, White Privilege in Social Services, which again, I'd encourage you to have a look at when you get your copy of this presentation. There's a long history of cultural competence, both theory and practice within social work. And of course, there is a sort of mainstream movement to decolonize curriculums, including social work education and policy, I would argue. In terms of professional responsibilities, social workers must evaluate their roles and moral and regulatory responsibilities. The current race relations require social workers to be proactive and do our homework to stay contemporarily astute as allies to Black and ethnic minority colleagues and service users. However, I should say that social workers of colour cannot and should not be expected to fix the racism in their workplace. However, those of us who are confident and capable enough with the right support can have a crucial role in educating, empowering and equipping ourselves and potential allies and influencers to enhance and shape anti-racism initiatives in our workplace settings. Everyone has a duty to combat racism and other forms of discrimination in the spaces they occupy, and this includes reporting racist incidents when they occur, forming like-minded alliances with peers to tackle key issues, raising awareness, and making suggestions for positive reform and change. How much of a priority is anti-racism in social work, really? Anti-racism in social work must be fully considered and dismantled through collaboration with social workers of colour in roles as experts with personal and professional lived experience. This is the only way that Black and ethnic minority social workers' basic needs can be properly met and their wide-ranging expertise fully utilised. Of course, this approach can only improve the experiences of Black and ethnic minority service users too. It really is just a question of how much of a priority is anti-racism in social work. And that, for me, is a fundamental question. Having been in this work, involved in this work now for over a year, that's the overriding question. How much of a priority is it for individuals, teams, organizations, stakeholders? Workplace racism, pigmentocracy versus meritocracy. I'm not going to labour this slide, but just to give you some insights, the covert, entrenched and everyday racism in the workplace sometimes indicates the lack of quality cultural diversity and multicultural education and training available to all staff. Surprisingly, it is rarely acknowledged that race is simply a socially constructed idea with no scientific validity, invented and refined principally to oppress people of colour. And this has modern and everyday ramifications in the working environment. I'm going to skip the next paragraph because I'm sure you'll be aware already of some examples of different types of racism within social work. But just to emphasise that these perverse experiences can be impossible for victims of naked and slippery everyday racism to articulate to others or reconcile internally themselves. Furthermore, these incidents are normalised and subsumed in many workplace cultures with limited opportunities to professionally offload. And going back to the BPS group that I mentioned, that was one of the primary reasons that I wanted to create that group to allow a space nationally for social workers of colour to be able to offload. Obviously, we're limited by kind of resources and numbers of people who we can accommodate, and we will look to expand, I think, in the future. But we've certainly been able to provide that space and create solutions, hopefully, going forward about how anti-racism can be implemented in different areas. Forgive me if you can hear my builders in the background there. Just having some work done, apologies. Anti-racism from people without colour involves. Now, this is a infographic that I created some time ago, and I'm not going to outline each particular example, but just to give you a flavour. So anti-Black racism looks like an inability to take direction from Black people. It looks like, conflating anti-Black racism with issues faced by people without colour. Confusion when Black people are successful. Knowingly being condescending and or patronising towards Black people. Knowingly appropriating Black culture. Taking no action when faced with clear evidence of racism. Treating Black children like adults, adultification. And finally, unnecessarily trying to compete with Black people. And that list's not exhaustive, but hopefully, it gives you a flavour. Here's another infographic. I'll not labour this one either, and apologies that the text is quite small, but hopefully you can decipher it. This is an infographic that explores different types of white identity. So we have white supremacy, white indifference, white awareness, and then white allyship. Just to give you a few examples then of each. So in terms of white supremacy, that looks like, or is characterized by the white gaze, a belief that we live in a meritocracy. On some level, they might subscribe to scientific racism or medical racism, I would argue. White privilege is rationalized as the natural order. And finally, the onus is on Black people to accept their place. The next type of identity is white indifference, and that involves a belief in meritocracy, but also recognises that some deserving disadvantaged people need help. They have a willingness to tolerate, fetishize, pity the non-white other. They might be happy to make tokenistic gestures, but totally refuse to accept one's own complicity in the reproduction of racism. And finally, the onus is on Black people to build up their resilience. In terms of white awareness, some examples of that include a desire to engage with Black issues and people, but only in limited spaces. That might be committees, training events, and so on. White privilege is recognised and becomes a source of shame and embarrassment. And finally, the onus is on white people to overcome unconscious bias. And finally, in terms of white allyship, some examples of that is an understanding that racism is a complex interaction between structural, ideological, institutional, and behavioural processes, but it can be overcome. There is an approach of dynamic and creative solutions through co-creation, a willingness to share power, privilege, risk, and vulnerability. And they recognise the onus is on white people to build sustained partnerships with Black people. And that's an infographic from Gurnam Singh, whose work I would encourage you to look at if you haven't already. Here's another infographic. I give the small text. I'm not going to dwell on this one, but it is just a very interesting insight into what might be considered overt white supremacy and covert white supremacy. How one is socially unacceptable, but how the other has other aspects which are socially acceptable. I'll just give you a moment just to have a look at that. So barriers to meaningful organisational change. Before any meaningful change can be achieved, social work leaders must acknowledge the inherent and intrinsic nature of whiteness, white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy as unconscious bias in most, if not all, institutions, structures, and organisational cultures. Individual and organisational awareness is an imperative first step for social workers, employers, and educators to address workplace racism effectively. Here's another infographic which outlines the 4 dimensions of racism. I'll just skim over this, but the 4 dimensions are institutional, structural, internalized, and interpersonal. Another wordy slide, I'm afraid. You can't read yourself into activism. Anti-racism in social work risks being perceived as radical activism or anarchic ideology. Our social work leaders must reverse this flawed belief system. Social work policy, practice, and education needs to properly recognise and reflect that race is a socially constructed idea, as I was saying earlier. Race remains an unstable concept because it is superficially based on physical appearance. When race was constructed, people knew very little about DNA, genetics, and human origins. It is an outdated colonial invention that still permeates modern society. Intellectually and morally, as a profession and as a society, we must see beyond what was predetermined for us centuries ago. So, if society is built on plantations of racism, still celebrates racist history and traditions, and reminds us daily of the inescapability of white supremacy, it's not enough for social workers and social work organisations to be colourblind or non-racist. We must be proactively anti-racist. Otherwise, anything else is just tiresome lip service. If anti-racism in social work does not exist for social workers, can it ever truly exist for service users? Anti-racism is absolutely integral to social work, so when will it be given the credence it deserves? Without standing up for our defining values and ethics, what is to stop us succumbing to the pervasive and pernicious postmodern sleaze. Dr. Muna Abdi, a leading anti-racist educator, states the work of anti-racism is to fight racism wherever you see it, even in yourself. The struggle cannot be found in the pages of a book. You can't read yourself into activism. Sooner or later, you'll have to make a choice. Do what is safe or do what is right. Here's another infographic. Again, apologies for the small text. I'm not going to go into this in any huge detail other than to let you know that it is the pyramid of hate, and it explains how the beginnings of sort of biased attitudes, stereotyping, insensitive remarks and so on, how they can progressively lead to genocide, which may seem a bit of a reach, but when you dissect this infographic, when you get your copy of this, you'll be able to see the connections there. I believe there are three typical responses to anti-racism from social work organisations. And from my cultured social work experience, the responses below generally indicate an organisation's prioritisation and level of commitment or not to anti-racism. So the first is to keep silent, keep things the same, and hope this Black Lives Matter stuff just blows over. This kind of inaction and paralysis of fear correlates with and reinforces perceptions of white fragility, white privilege, and white supremacy for some people of colour. This type of organisational response usually commends staff for being resilient and deflects attention away from the essential redesign of systems that routinely make people suffer. The second type of response is to publish lukewarm organisational statements that recycle and regurgitate previous rhetoric on workforce unity with predictable and borderline offensive platitudes, often proposing only superficial changes. For example, publishing a sympathetic but non-committal, knee-jerk brief statement, possibly delegating responsibilities to an already overworked equalities officer, or proposing minor changes to already vague policies and procedures on valuing diversity with little or no accountability. Approaches at this level are usually well-intended but tokenistic and overlook the nuanced obstacles and pitfalls people of colour face every day. Unfortunately, this response is common. And finally, the ideal response is to publish an authentic anti-racist action plan outlining significant reforms that commit to specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic targets. And there's some ideas in the next few slides. For example, publishing a strong mission or position statement condemning George Floyd's murder and racism in all its forms, and committing to BASW's Code of Ethics, anti-oppressive, anti-discriminatory, and anti-racist practice. This approach interlinks with the anti-racist commitment framework, which I've developed, and I'll show you in a moment. The acid test is to share this presentation with your social work leaders and see what response you get. Here is a visual representation of those three typical responses, and it shows myself up against Manchester United goalkeeper David De Gea. You can see that the first response is dismal, where I shoot into the crowd, and this is sort of the equivalent of noteworthy silences. Anti-racism is not discussed, and there are no attempts to acknowledge or address racism. Leaders hope all this Black Lives Matter stuff just blows over. The second response is where I hit the stanchion or crossbar, where I fluffed it, and this involves cringe position statements and feeble blogs, recycled statements from years ago, regurgitated previous rhetoric on workforce unity, but no action, ultimately. Unfortunately, this response is common. And the third response is where I managed to score a goal, and that involves authentic anti-racist action plans, which, as I said before, are specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic and target-based. I'm not going to labour this, but this is the anti-racist commitment framework. The next few slides are where I've tried to identify realistic solutions that won't cost the earth, that will help promote an anti-racist culture in workplaces. So there's 4 main strands. The first strand is accelerating diversity within the organisation, and they give some ideas there as to how that might be done. I then talk about educating, empowering and equipping the workforce. Again, some examples of how that might be done. Leading by example, so senior leaders and what their roles and responsibilities are in terms of anti-racism. And then finally, building transparency, which is about data collection, but also using data to ensure that some of the protections and support that I talked about right at the outset, that those can be created based on the evidence and the data that's been collected. Here's another infographic on becoming an anti-racist. And you'll see the first zone is the fear zone, then we have the learning zone, and then the growth zone. And within each zone are some of the different narratives, mindsets that people might have as they progress. I suppose the only criticism of that infographic is that in reality the growth zone is infinite, and anti-racism really is a lifelong commitment that requires someone to practice it both personally and professionally. It's not just a coat that we put on for work. Okay, just to move on. What needs to happen nationally? Another wordy slide, but just to paraphrase, the existing national frameworks and initiatives, I feel, are fragmented and optional in terms of support for social workers of colour. This creates confusion and dilution in their coherence. Social work's got a long history of committing to anti-discriminatory practice and anti-oppressive and anti-racist practice, but less in the way of actually implementing them in a mandatory way or providing robust challenge on these issues. So I think now's the time for social work leaders to properly address this meaningfully and purposefully. And one of the ways they could do that is by establishing an anti-discriminatory national framework, a little bit like perhaps what I've just outlined in the previous slide in terms of anti-racism. And I guess a fundamental requirement would be that it would be universal across social work and not just specific to local authorities, say, for example, but for any organisation that employs a social worker. I think an important first step is to explicitly reintroduce ADP, AOP and anti-racist values into the regulatory standards for social workers. This should also involve partnership working between key stakeholders to ensure that these values and ethics are properly embedded across the professional landscape. I've outlined there some of the key objectives, which would be to ensure consistency, introduce mandatory requirements, emphasize the values and ethics which are intrinsic to social work, and to make sure that they're universally applicable, as I was saying before. We all know that organisations can sometimes be avoidant of anti-racism, but as social workers, we must recognise that silence or inaction on racism is complicity with the oppressors. Unfortunately, as a profession, we've been complacent and we've got much more to do to cultivate equality, diversity and inclusion in the workplace and society. The BAME conundrum. BAME does not describe who I am. BAME is a clumsy, cluttered and incoherent acronym that is opportune for categorising people of colour as a homogeneous group when we quite clearly are not. Of course, I cannot speak for all people of colour. I understand that BAME can be operationally helpful when exploring the overarching effects of all things racist. However, it misses so much nuance and subtlety that it can be seized upon by those who wish to deny racism as a white problem. Routinely, I hear people comfortably stating that BAME people can't even agree amongst themselves. This sloppy reductivism leads to terms being invented such as black on black crime. I never hear about white on white crime, ever. I'm not going to labour the next few slides, but what they are some of the solutions that I talked about before, that just to make the point, I suppose, that, you know, I believe there's a place for us to offload about the, you know, overarching effects of racism, some of which I've captured in this presentation. But I also believe that we need to be able to, you know, look at solutions and ways forward and what that might look like. So the next few slides are my attempts really to try and capture what an anti-racist working environment might look like, what social work employers would do to promote anti-racism in the workplace, and what the experience would be like for social workers of colour. As I say, I'm not going to labour the slides, but just to give you the sort of overview of the headings, which are around recruitment, the workforce in terms of education, in terms of empowerment and equipping both social workers of colour and allies and organisations taking the necessary steps on their journey towards being an anti-racist organisation in terms of allyship. So there's some examples there of how that might be implemented. I'll give you a moment just to have a little browse. Okay, in terms of education, which is the next heading, anti-racist education is recognised as being at the heart of developing a more cultured and inclusive workforce and healthy workplace. Education providers decolonise training programs, as I've talked about earlier. ADP, AOP and anti-racist practice form a fundamental and mandatory requirement of social workers' professional development, but also their registration with the social work regulator. I talk there about what the education might actually include at a basic level in terms of microaggressions, stereotypes, and how they can demonstrate anti-racist practice. I also talk about different learning styles there, so that education isn't delivered in a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, but actually, you know, considers people's different learning styles. We won't be able to, you know, cater for everyone, but, you know, it'd be nice if there were a selection of ways in which anti-racist education could be delivered. I also add there about utilising the expertise of specialist external trainers and consultants, you know, people who really know what they're talking about in terms of anti-racism. I still consider myself a novice. The next headline really is around allyship, what that means, about that being understood by senior leaders, educators, practitioners, and so on, combating all manifestations of racism, the education, empowerment, and you know, equipping allies that I talked about, and the sort of recognition really of the various struggles that people from marginalised and minority groups, what they face every day. Allyship actively promotes ways in which managers and staff can become allies or become better allies. And social work leaders demonstrate they're willing to keep listening and learning. Here's an infographic which outlines the 7 A's of authentic allyship, which are appetite, ask, accept, acknowledge, apologize, assume, and action. A couple of the other main headings were around reverse mentoring, which is about Black and ethnic minority social workers, mentoring senior leaders and educators on anti-racism, especially those with identified anti-racist needs. It's a bit of a euphemism there. It is important reverse mentoring allows mentors some autonomy in their approach. Furthermore, mentoring agreements considering confidentiality, power dynamics, and conflict resolution are agreed and signed by both parties at the outset. Excuse me. And I think the mentoring agreements really are vital in terms of reverse mentoring. Without that, I think the reverse mentor really is left far too vulnerable, as my own personal view. In terms of leadership, to combat glass ceiling racism, which is a term which we've used in the BPS group that I mentioned. We held an event last year called Smashing the Glass Ceiling, which was about career progression for social workers and professionals of colour, which will be available actually by the portfolio you'll have that I'll share with this presentation. So I'd invite you to have a look at that, what the terminology means. So to combat glass ceiling racism, various professional development opportunities are available, designed to provide advice and support colleagues from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds to enhance their career progression. Some of the other types or ways in which leadership programs could be developed could be around positive representation, recognizing some of the disadvantages and obstacles, but also providing opportunities in terms of traditional mentoring, nominations, secondments, shadowing, etc., to enable people to reach their full potential. And finally, around representational imbalance and funding, and that being ring-fenced, operational resources to support leadership programs, all of those things, it's important that they are in place to create this anti-racist working environment. So this kind of approach addresses the lack of Black and ethnic minority social workers in senior roles and provides support for those who are. Thank you for listening.
Well, Wayne, I thought that was fantastic. I think you've put so many things on the table. My mind is racing, and I can imagine everyone's mind is racing. So I think it would be really good for any questions or observations or any summation, anything that people want to put on the table. It'd be really nice to open up for discussion, if you're okay with that, Wayne.
I am, yeah, thank you. No question's a silly question as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Unless it's really silly.
There's a few things that I did want to ask, but I would like other people to jump in first, but there's a few things that I've got on my mind.
Okay.
So do people want me to go first? Okay, the sort of things that come out for me, Wayne, in hearing your presentation, and I do want to, out of respect, to say it's a fantastic presentation. I'm really impressed. You've touched on so many areas that it was almost, it just warmed my heart when I was thinking about, you know, that you've broken it down, you've sort of almost, you've unpicked it or dissected it, and then you try to put together something different, which I think is really helpful.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Means a lot.
I think the sort of things that touch on me, that came up for me, because particularly thinking about this idea of mental wealth and emotional well-being, was about firstly nourishment. How do Black and Black social workers who are managers or who are practitioners, how do they nourish themselves? Particularly, I think it becomes, COVID has highlighted the sorts of, some of the issues that you've talked about even more. They've put, you know, they've sort of exacerbated some of those in a way, but also highlighted them. So something about nourishment. How can Black social workers and their allies nourish themselves, keep themselves nourished? Because that's what I think putting together the emotional wealth, the mental wealth, sorry, and emotional well-being was partly about. So something about that nourishment. How can people nourish themselves, their mind, etc.? I think the other couple of questions, I'll throw them in. So I like the idea of authenticity. How can they remain true to themselves in the context of trying to cope with what you've described, and still remain true to themselves? And then something also about linked with that authenticity is about spirituality, and I throw that out more in the sense of infusing that soul. How, so it overlaps with that nourishment. How can that, on that spiritual level, not in a religious way, but in a spiritual, like looking after yourself, how can Black social work practitioners, managers, etc., and their allies retain that sense of spirituality, not in a religious way, but in a self-care way? Those are the three I wanted to throw out for you.
Right. Okay. I mean, you've you've not given me any easy ones to start with there, Andrew. But okay. My take on that is that although there were kind of three aspects to your question, for me, I guess they're one and the same, really. I read the excerpt from Outlanders where I talked about be authentic, stay true to yourself. In terms of, I suppose I can only talk about my own approach to this, and you know, I'm sort of not perfect by any stretch, but what I try to sort of remind myself is sort of, you know, who I am in terms of my self-identity, how I'm perceived in terms of my social identity, and I guess what I'm trying to achieve, both on a personal and on a professional level. And so, in terms of nourishment, one of the things for me that works is, like I said this morning, before speaking to yourselves, I'd sort of got up 6 o'clock, went for my bike ride, you know, did 20 odd miles, which is feeble compared to a lot of proper cyclists. But for me, that's like, you know, enough to set me up for the day. Now I feel like I'm ready to attack the day. Do you know what I mean? But it depends, you know, it's horses for courses, isn't it? And I think it's about people having a level of self-awareness of what makes them tick and getting enough of that to keep them going. But at the same time, just being aware of, you know, who am I, what am I part of, and what am I trying to achieve? Kind of, you know, that's my sort of take on it. And I'd like to think that keeps me authentic, that keeps me centered. Work-life balance is important, and again, I need to practice what I preach with that one. But it's important, I think, that people, you know, I think, like I mentioned in the Outlanders thing, about utilizing the advice and support of your formal and informal networks and identify suitable mentors and positive role models. You know, that's key for me. There's people who are in my life personally and professionally who I admire, who I've looked up to and I consider mentors, or people who, you know, people who might not be friends or family, who I might not even like, but there might just be an aspect of the way they undertake social work or do whatever. And I think, you know, I need to emulate some of that in my practice. So I've always been a bit like that, where I will sort of beg, steal, or borrow, I guess, certain aspects of certain things. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. Excellent. Could I just ask you to stop sharing the presentation so that when people speak, if we could actually see them, that would be really good. But that's brilliant. That's really helpful.
Okay.
Wayne, I just want to say thank you. That was really informative and interesting kind of presentation, and so much food for thought, really, and touched on so many of the kind of the things that I've been really thinking about myself, kind of personally, particularly over the last year, I think. And yeah, just one of my roles is supporting newly qualified social workers. So we run development groups, we do supervision, and we assess their practice. And it's just made me really think about how absent these conversations are with our newly qualifieds in terms of their experiences. And yeah, I think that's just really helpful and really inspired kind of my thinking and hopefully our thinking as a team to kind of how we can be more explicit. And I think that's the problem. It's this sort of, it's not about being not racist, it's the anti-racist and being proactive and kind of pushing that. So that's really helpful. We've got a meeting this afternoon about our next year's development programme, and I'm hoping, and Caroline, who's here, is in my team as well, and it would be really good to think about how we can run a session that helps look at this, really.
Yeah, good. I'm glad it's inspired that thought. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it really has. So thank you. And hopefully, we'll read the book. I wonder if there's some excerpts from that we can use to start discussion.
I'm sure there is. Yeah. And just to say as well, I've read an excerpt that was mine, but there's lots of other people's work in there as well. That's far better than mine, really. But it's just such a nice compilation. I think different people will get different things from Outlanders. So enjoy that if you do read it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Wayne, for coming and presenting your presentation. And I think I just want to acknowledge one thing first, which is standing in your truth as a human being. taking the gifts and the talents and the information that you've been given.
Thank you.
To share sensitively from your platform, working for BASW. I remember meeting you at one of the World Social Work events a good couple of years ago.
Right.
We sat next to one another, and we was
Forgive
so that
me
was
if I've not remembered. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've seen that many faces now. You know, so forgive me, Jackie, but you know,
no problem. The second thing was about the authenticity of having the courage to step forward in a very human way, especially when we talk about the arena of personal and professional social work. Like Anna said, we don't enter into this dialogue very often, and I think against the climate of racism that's rearing its head globally across the world, and discrimination of different groups, and how it's impacting the so-called BAME community, because I don't like that term myself. I'm sitting here thinking to myself that sometimes when I run group work, I always think about the aftercare of the participants in terms of making sure that they've got somewhere to go to once they've engaged with material or, you know, issues of this sort.
Yeah.
And I just wondered perhaps that might be something you might want to consider, because sometimes coming into this arena, you know, I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about how does one deal with the pain of working within an organization that one does not see you, one does not value you, and does not understand your contribution in terms of standing in your authenticity. The last time I was in my appraisal meeting, I actually told my manager there is no role for me in such an organization, because that's how I'm being made to feel. So, and many of my colleagues, some of them are on the platform here that I've worked with. And, you know, entering into this dialogue is not an easy step to take. And it's quite painful, especially when there's a window of invisibility that goes with, you spoke about white supremacy, white allyship. When you do speak in your authenticity, you are made to feel that you should be silent. So the reason why I'm going back to the aftercare is because in order for us to come forward and have these dialogues, there needs to be a degree of aftercare. Because different people are going to experience that experience differently. And I think that's something that I will be taking away from all of the good information that you've shared. I'd love to get involved in that symposium. I think
it's actually a closed group, you know, in that we may recruit later on in the year, but we're full.
Well, as soon as that window opens, please send me the invite, because
I will. Well, are you
I'll be very willing to get involved in that.
Are you on my mailing list, Jackie?
I don't know, but I can always come back to you about that.
Yeah, do.
I just want to honor the space that I'm in and the realism of it, and I just want to thank you for that. I don't know how it's going to open up dialogue amongst senior management and senior leadership. I've yet to see that. I'm not saying that things are not happening in the background, but it's not impacting what I'm doing currently.
Right. Okay.
And that's just me being very real about it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna become quiet now, because this is a lot to take in, and sometimes coming into these arenas, especially with the decolonializing of the curriculum and the social work curriculum, is quite an important arm for us to consider how we're going to do that. All right, so I'll just give other people an opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for all those comments. I mean, you crammed a lot in there, just like I crammed a lot into my presentation. But let me try and come back on a few things that you'd said. One thing about and thank you, you know, for your complimentary feedback as well, by the way. In terms of the aftercare that you talked about, that's a really valid point, because I recognise a lot of what I've talked about is traumatizing in some ways for people who have experienced it or who are going through that, as I have been myself. And it's difficult getting the balance between sort of me almost being my authentic self and that being a sort of burden on others to some degree. But I think, and this might sound a bit selfish, I think I'm that much of a kind of extremist when it comes to anti-racism. I'm almost having to kind of just let other people consider that, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
Let you know, organizations that I'm encouraging to create the protections and support for social workers of colour. You know, my hope is that these kind of presentations will provoke those sort of internal discussions that then lead to those kind of protections and support being developed, if that makes sense. One of the ways that I've tried to do that was yesterday I published a report through BASW, which was about mapping all the anti-racism in social work activities that have taken place across England and the UK over the last 12 months. So you'll be able to see that on the BASW website. I'd encourage you to have a look. Part of, or one of the benefits of that, I think, is that different social work organisations, whether they be HEIs or universities or, you know, kind of councils or whatever, they can kind of see what their neighbours are doing, and they can see what people, you know, the other side of the country are doing in terms of anti-racism. And if there are certain aspects of the work that align, then they can kind of get in touch with each other. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, of course.
And the report also has lots of attachments included for each every organisation that's contributed to it. But some of those attachments include things like action plans. They include minutes from meetings. They, you know, just speaking generally, but they include flyers from events. They include all sorts of different things, which, as I say, people can either replicate or they can get in touch with those organisations and say, you know, we've seen that you did this via BASW's report. You know, we'd like to partner with you, or could you, you know, liaise with us on that? That's one of the benefits of the report. So again, coming back to the aftercare side of things, my hope, you know, I'm aware that some employers, some HEIs are developing those type of protections and support. It may well be that Goldsmiths and other organisations want to kind of look at that report and, you know, reach out to other organisations and kind of try and co-produce something maybe.
Yeah, I'd love to be a part of a movement regarding the aftercare provision of being engaging in this type of dialogue, because we haven't we barely touched the surface, and it's not something I think. Yeah, we've just barely touched the surface. I mean, I'm very interested in senior management taking your presentation, or you coming and doing a presentation to our senior management and senior leaders. I would love to see that happen. I would love to be in a room to hear how those dialogues and conversations are taking place, so that I can see, do I actually have a place? Do I have a place in this or not? Or should I, you know, exit and find something else to occupy my time?
Well, my response to that is two things. One is that my reason for asking for this session to be recorded was so that it could be, you know, seen by people who can't join us today, perhaps from your team or your organisation, but also, you know, and that could include senior leaders. So rather than get me in again, and as I was saying before, my time is very limited. I'm sort of booked up for the rest of the year now, but they could potentially watch this video, look at the presentation, listen to this exchange that we've had, and perhaps based on that, you could see what their response is, and you would know from that where you were, if you see what I mean.
Yeah,
that would be my suggestion. The other thing then I wanted to do, let me see if I can do this.